President.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I submit to the Senate the budget for fiscal year 2025. Last summer, Congress agreed to a 2-year budget deal as part of negotiations surrounding the debt limit. That was the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, the FRA. It included a provision to serve in place of a formal budget resolution for both fiscal years 2024 and 2025. And I'm submitting the necessary budgetary levels to implement that agreement today. In the Budget Committee, my Republican colleagues have suggested that we should be debating a budget resolution. So I'll take this moment to remind them that we already have one in place from that agreement. I don't see our committee wasting precious time on something that has already been decided when we could, and indeed should, be preparing for the future. When at least $10 trillion of our national debt stems from 2 exogenous shocks to the economy, namely the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, it would be folly for the Budget Committee not to focus on future shocks to our economy, which is why the Budget Committee has been focused on threats to our nation's long-term fiscal outlook and on proposing solutions, like how climate change poses systemic risks to our economy, like how tax cuts for the wealthy are driving up deficits, like how making the wealthy pay their fair share would protect Social Security and Medicare essentially forever, like how we can cut health care costs with 0 cuts to benefits if we pursue common sense reforms to health care delivery systems. When it comes to the economy-wide risks from climate change, we've heard from economists, central bankers, financial experts, insurance and mortgage industry leaders, and many others who are ringing the alarm bells. In the Budget Committee, we've heard testimony about rising seas making large swaths of coastline less and less habitable and less insurable. I'm sure the presiding officer is seeing that in his home state of Georgia. As the decades unspool ahead of us, more and more coastal communities will be at risk, eventually rendering an estimated trillions of dollars in real estate virtually worthless. We've heard similar testimony about property becoming uninsurable in wildfire risk areas. We're already seeing insurers flee communities on the front lines of climate change. We've seen premiums skyrocketing in response to increased climate-related damages. Things will likely get uglier. So the committee launched investigations into the climate change-fueled insurance crises. We are working with Democrats on the House Oversight Committee on an investigation into the fossil fuel disinformation campaign in order to better understand how it stalled political progress on climate action and imperiled our economy. What our joint investigation revealed is that big oil knew the environmental and economic harms of its products, but deceived the American public so as to keep producing and selling ever more oil and gas. We learned that big oil and its trade associations continue to oppose climate policies, including ones that they publicly claim to support. Unfortunately, our series of hearings on climate costs and the fossil fuel industry's role in perpetuating the climate crisis have been largely met with derision or mockery or just trying to change the subject by many of my Republican colleagues. As I said at our last hearing on this subject, you can have your opinion now, but history will judge. While acknowledging that revenue is a subject within the purview of the Budget Committee, the Republican response to our hearings on raising revenue has not evinced much substantive interest. Not much outrage, for instance, that big corporations pay lower tax rates than plumbers. The Budget Committee has held 7 hearings, with more planned, examining how tax cuts for the wealthy and for big corporations and the resulting tax gap have been actually primary drivers of our deficit. We've learned that the Bush and Trump tax cuts have added $10 trillion to the debt, and in fact are the main reason that debt as a share of the economy is increasing. According to CBO, extending the Trump tax cuts, which Republicans appear to want to do, would cost another $4.6 trillion. That's trillion with a T, mostly for billionaires and big corporations. You can see where the priorities lie. We've heard testimony that by closing loopholes, making the wealthy and large corporations pay a fairer share, and cracking down on wealthy tax cheats, we can protect Social Security and Medicare forever, invest in an economy that works for everyone, and reduce our deficit. Like my Medicare and Social Security Fair Share Act, which would shore up these twin pillars of retirement security essentially forever, without raising taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. What have Republicans proposed? Well, not much. They spent decades trying to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits, and then they rose to their feet in acclamation in last year's State of the Union address to assure the American public that they would not cut benefits. Well, if that's the case, then the only solution left is more revenue. So it'd be nice if they were willing to discuss how to make the wealthy pay their fair share and protect these programs into the future. Another big driver of federal spending is health care. The U.S. continues to spend more on health care as a percentage of GDP than any other peer OECD country, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid actuary estimates that health spending will grow to 20% of GDP by 2031. For all that spending, the average life expectancy in America is lower than that of many peer countries with far more efficient healthcare systems. So the Budget Committee is tackling this too. We've held a series of hearings on reducing inefficiencies in healthcare that increase costs for patients, families, and for the federal government. In just our most recent hearing, we heard how administrative burdens, the billing, the reporting, and all the non-clinical work incident to the actual delivery of healthcare are responsible for over $500 billion in healthcare spending every year. And here I'm happy to report that there have been bipartisan glimmers of hope. There's been bipartisan agreement on the source of these problems, and I've begun conversations with Ranking Member Grassley about what legislation we might be able to work on together in this space. I can only wish that my Republican colleagues were similarly willing to have serious conversations on climate risk and on revenue opportunities. As our hearings have made clear, if you care about America's debt and deficits, you have to care about climate change, about unrigging our tax code, and about addressing wasteful spending in health care. And with that, Section 122 of the FRA requires that I submit the levels that will be used to enforce the second year of the spending agreement. This submission sets the spending levels for appropriations for 2025 at the spending caps in law and allows the Appropriations Committee to begin its work. It also sets mandatory spending and revenue levels for 10 years at current law levels. I'm also updating the reserve fund in the FRA to be available for legislation that doesn't increase the deficit between 2025 and 2034. And in conclusion, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that these accompanying tables be printed in the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I will momentarily yield the floor.